Before we get started, I wanted to share with you very quickly something about me. My goal in life was never to go around training people on the CMS HCBS Settings Rule. I was actually working as the head of Louisiana's Office for Citizens with Developmental Disabilities back in 2011 when the first proposed rule came out. And it was at that time that I was reading the information about the rule and thought, oh my goodness, I'm going to be responsible for implementing this in our state, but I had no point person to hand it off to. I wound up leaving the state, but a lot of the providers that I worked with and family members knew me and felt comfortable. A lot of them had my cell phone number. And so they would call me. And I was getting a lot of calls at nights and weekends about the CMS HCBS rule. And finally, I decided, all right, I'm going to figure out how to do a webinar. Keep in mind, this is years ago. I didn't know how to do the webinars back then. I'm going to figure out how to do a webinar, and I'm going to offer it free to everybody. So all the people that I knew, all the providers and families, and they can share it with others. And I'm going to just answer everybody's questions all at the same time. And that was probably the stupidest thing I thought, because what happened is that those providers then went to national conferences where they had, where they were working with others or meeting with others. And those other people were complaining about the CMS rule. And they said, I know what you should do. You should call Laura. Here's her cell phone number. So my goal was to try and stop, answer questions, but it just wound up kind of exploding. So it wasn't my intent, but I am happy to help, to share this information with folks. Now, I want to ask you a question. And the question is, when I say those words, CMS, HCBS Settings Rule, how many of you are like this? You're like, yay, CMS rules. No? Raise your hand. Nobody? One person's excited about it. Well, the truth is that most people are not happy about it at all. Really, that's the experience that I see. And some people are pretty vocal about being unhappy, and they're like, "You're going to make me do what?" And even if people aren't vocal about it, even if they're not really mad about it, the reality is that it's a rule. People don't like rules. It's change. That's hard for folks, and so most people aren't happy about it. And so one of the most common questions that I got early on from folks is this rule a good thing? And at that time I said, yes. And I'll explain that in a second. Now the question I get is, Laura, do you still think it's a good thing? And we'll get to that in just a second. When you look at what the true goal of CMS is, and the true goal is to make services better, which is person-centered, focused on outcomes, and to protect people's rights. And when you look at the rule from that perspective, this rule is a very, very, very good rule. Now, I know some of y'all might be thinking that's not my experience. But if you think about it, do we want services to be better for people? I think all of us would say, yes, we want services to be better for people. Do we want them to be person-centered? Do we want to be focused on each person? Yes. Do we want them to have outcomes? Yes. Do we want people to have rights? Do we want to make sure that people don't lose their rights just because they're getting Medicaid funded services? And I think we would all agree with that. So where's the problem? The problem is going beyond the federal requirements. And so what's happening and what happened early on with the rule is that states, when the rule first came out, states started implementing without having all the guidance that they really needed. So guidance kind of trickled out early on. But you also had a couple other problems that were happening or that were leading to the rollout of this. One is that the original proposed rule came out in 2011, and it was very, very much focused on physical characteristics and geographic locations of property. So very much about buildings and geographic locations. But when CMS collected like 27,000 responses, they then made changes to the rule and focused not so much on the physical characteristics to define home and community-based services, but they focused more on the nature and quality of a person's experiences. But the problem is that all the people that had read all that information ahead of time, states preparing for it, they were kind of focused on all the physical characteristics. And so it was kind of hard for folks to kind of like make that shift away from those physical characteristics. It also didn't help that they called it the CMS HCBS Settings Rule, which implies just physical locations. In hindsight, I wish they would have called it the CMS HCBS Experiences rule, to really focus, or something that focuses on the person as opposed to the building. Because what I've seen so much of what has happened is there's been so much focus on the buildings to the exclusion of the focus on the person. And so lots of misunderstandings on the parts of states and others with the rule coming out. But then you also have what you've also had is the specific agendas that were being pushed. And so, if there was a particular group or a state that was very focused on one particular area that they wanted to move, they used this as an opportunity to kind of like aggressively move in a certain direction. And so where does that leave us? Well, the current challenges that we are facing now is that there are some states that are, for lack of a better word, blaming the federal government and saying, oh, we're doing this because the feds are making us do it. But what that does is it makes individuals and family members and providers almost feel a little bit powerless. I mean, it's one thing to have to try and work with maybe a state agency and getting some things changed at the state level and advocating at the state level, but it's a totally different situation and almost seems overwhelming to have to change something at the federal level, or if you think you have to change something at the federal level. The other challenge for where we are now is that some states, even though additional guidance has come out from an additional clarification from CMS, some states are kind of so far down the road that they are not wanting to pull back or change direction. And so those are the two main things that are really the biggest challenge for us right now. And so my goals in this presentation today are, one, to provide you with some general recommendations for what I think needs to be done in terms of moving forward. Also to address some specific concerns related to heightened scrutiny, because I know that that's a really big issue and a really big concern for folks. And then the third piece is I want to share some examples of some specific strategies that are being used by providers across the country to come into compliance. I want to show you what's happening and share those examples so that you can see how might that apply to the services that your family member receives or that you receive, or might that apply for you if you are actually in a provider agency and providing services. So general recommendations: know your power, know your facts, educate and advocate. In terms of knowing your power, you actually have more power as an individual, family member, and as a provider than you realize you have. Prior to me going to the state and working at the state agency, I was in the advocacy arena, and I was working for a statewide advocacy organization advocating for folks. And I was approached to come to, I wasn't looking to go to the state agency. I was approached and they came to me and they said, hey, Laura, will you come help us run this office? And I was happy where I was, but I thought, I'm always over at the state agency anyway. My husband actually called that my main office and called the advocacy office my satellite office, because I was over at the Louisiana Department of Health so much. But so I was over there so much all the time anyway, trying to get changes made. But I thought maybe I'll have more power on the inside than I do on the outside. And so actually, when I moved to the state, I actually said, I'm taking one for the team. I'm going to go there and I'm going to just be able to make some changes. And that also was not a very smart thought on my part, because one of the things that I realized, it was a really good lesson learned for me, is that I realized that I actually had more power on the outside than I did on the inside. Once you're inside state government, you are put into certain silos, whereas outside, you can almost say what you need to say about every single department that might be involved in home and community-based services, the licensing department, the DD office, the Medicaid rules and regulations. You have a voice in all of that. When you go into a specific office, then it's almost like you need to kind of stay in your little silo. At least was my experience, but I also know that that's also the experiences of others that I've spoken with as well that have done the same thing. And so you actually do have a lot of power and the power to create change. The second thing I want to say is know your facts. Knowledge is power, but it's very important to know what is and isn't in the federal rule. When I first learned about Together for Choice, I was very excited about it. I was very excited that there was a group that was bringing together all entities to really focus on choice and what choice really means. And I'm glad that they've been working over the last couple of years to provide information and to help people understand what really is in the rule and what's not in the rule. The reality is that there are very few prohibited settings. And I'm not going into all the details of the CMS rule, but just as a brief understanding of a few things, there are very few prohibited settings. CMS is not trying to eliminate options. They are trying to expand options. The rule is not about buildings and physical characteristics, although it feels like it. It is about the nature and quality of people's experiences. It is about the person. Some people say, well, why does the rule talk about, how many houses you can have on a street, or whether there's a fence around your property, or, well, the reason for that is to try and get states to look at some of those physical characteristics, not because you can't have a fence around your property, not because you can't have multiple houses on the same street. It's just that those types of characteristics tend to limit options. And so the guidance from CMS to states is to make sure you look at those things, those characteristics, to make sure that they're not limiting options. And so the other piece is know your specific state. It's very important to know your state and not have any assumptions. And this is something that actually that Melissa Harris has said, even to your specific group, Together for Choice, that you really need to know what's happening in each state. Each state is different. The federal rules are the same, but states are doing things differently. And so you need to know what's happening, what are the state rules and regulations, but then what is your state and where are the differences between those? Is your state going beyond the rules? And if so, where are they going beyond the rules? And then the next piece is educate and advocate, which I know that y'all are all doing. But the reason I wanted to mention this is that a lot of the advocacy efforts really need to be focused on the state, not on the federal government. And it is critical that folks band together to address this. Again, that's part of the reason why I said I was really pleased to learn Together for Choice and what they were doing. One of the things that I don't know if Together for Choice has considered, or if anybody has considered in individual states, is the possibility of having state chapters or state groups working together to address state issues. But again, focusing on the state and banding together to address the issues. So there's a lot of concern about heightened scrutiny. Again, the focus needs to be on state barriers first. One of the things that's very interesting that I'm not sure if people picked up on, but with the last call that Together for Choice had with Melissa Harris, she made the same statement about, you need to find out what's happening in your state. But she also talked about the heightened scrutiny process. And she mentioned something I think that is a very valuable piece of information. So if a entity undergoes heightened scrutiny and that then is sent to CMS, it is evaluated based on the federal requirements, not on the state requirements. And so if a state is going beyond the federal requirements, and then they determine you have to be evaluated under heightened scrutiny, then any misunderstandings between the state's understanding of what's an isolating setting and the federal government should be clarified during that process. So as folks move forward, as I've said before, it's important to focus on the person, not on the building. That isolation isn't caused by a building, it's caused by how people operate in that building. It's caused by their policies and procedures. It's caused by their rules and regulations. And that is what typically isolates folks. And even a setting that is located in a remote location can still provide opportunities for integration, can still provide choices, can still ensure people's rights. And so the physical location of being kind of removed from the broader community shouldn't be the sole reason for an entity to not be able to come into compliance with the rule. So, as I said, when the rule first came out, it was focused very much on physical characteristics. It switched, or they refined it. And when the rule came out in 2014, CMS defined home and community-based services with an outcome-oriented definition, focusing on the nature of quality of a person's experiences. And so basically, in terms of outcomes, they don't want people to just have a service that was delivered, but that a service and supports that make a difference in that person's life. And in terms of nature and quality of a person's experiences, CMS focuses on choices, rights, and opportunities for integration. And so I want to share some tips for compliance and what folks can do in order to move forward. And this initial information here is based on when I go and evaluate an entity for compliance, what are the things that I see physically that are keeping people from being in compliance with the rule? So some of the things that I look for is accessibility. If the rule is about a person's experiences and the nature and quality of a person's experiences, that person is not going to have very good experiences if the space is not that they use on a daily basis, or the space that they live in is not accessible to them. And so I will look at things like the path that a person must travel to get into the building, and then also the path once they're inside the building. When I talk about accessibility, I'm not talking about just meeting the ADA accessibility criteria. What I'm talking about is can the person use the space? And I'll share with you an example. Several years ago, I was executive director of an agency, and I did have an individual who worked with me who used a scooter for mobility. And the building was accessible, met all the ADA requirements. But one day she said to me, "Laura, can we cut down or remove the flowers from the flower bed in the front of the building?" And I was a little surprised by that. But after she explained it to me, I realized that the type of landscaping that we had, the flowers had really long, broad leaves that when it would rain, the water would collect in the leaves, and then they would flop over into the walkway. Well, I never realized it because I didn't use the ramp where this flower bed was adjacent to. I used a different path to get to the building. But all of these flowers and these large leaves would fall over into the walkway, making it difficult for her to get into the building. But the building was accessible according to the ADA. So it's really evaluating how does that space work for the individual to spend every day or to live in that space. Looking at mirrors in bathrooms. Sometimes we'll see things that are accessible where you can pull a wheelchair up, but the mirror is so high you can't see it. Light switches that are not accessible. There's another. I'll share another example. There's a famous restaurant in the town where I live, and they have a huge accessible restroom. But once you go into the restroom, and a lot of women will carry around a purse with them, but when you go in the restroom, the hook on the door is so high that in order for me to reach it, I've got to raise my arm really high. So, and in addition, the hook to close the door, it has one of the little hooks that I forgot what you call the little hooks, but it is also extremely high. So you can get into the bathroom and you can use the bathroom, but you can't shut the door. And so it's those kinds of things that make the experiences for a person positive experiences or negative experiences. The other thing that I'll look at in evaluating a building is I'll look at what they have on the wall. I am surprised at the number of programs that I'll go and visit that will have a lot of things on the wall that remind me of like a preschool or a kindergarten classroom. And I realize that can be very, very helpful to some individuals to visually see if they are learning to write. That could be very helpful. But there are other ways to do that there are other ways to share that information without making the entire room appear as if it is preschool or a kindergarten classroom. And I'm talking about a situation with adults. People that are wearing medical scrubs or name tags when they go out into the community. There's not necessarily anything wrong with wearing medical scrubs. There's actually some advantages to doing it. There's not necessarily anything wrong with wearing name tags, but if there are things that are being done that portray a certain image of the individuals that receive services, it can be a very negative thing. And so each provider agency needs to evaluate that to determine what's necessary and what's not necessary, and how does that reflect on the people that receive the services. The other thing things that I look at is I'll look at the restrooms, not just for accessibility, but for privacy. One provider agency, when I was with one provider agency, I actually asked to use the restroom, and they said, "Oh, well, come over to this one, don't use that one." And I said, "Well, why, what's wrong with that one?" And they said, "That one's for the clients and this one is for everybody else." And I said, "Well, what's the difference?" Well, the one for the clients didn't have a lock on the door. And so after I asked a few questions, what I found out was that about 15 years prior to this, two individuals who were receiving services did go in the bathroom, they locked the door, and they were having sex in the bathroom. And so then what happened is that they decided to remove the lock from the door. Well, the problem with that is that there were two people. Nobody should be having sex at work in the bathroom. It doesn't matter if you have a disability or not. But instead of addressing it with the two people, they then imposed a rule that impacted everyone. So because of the actions of those two people, no one got to use the restroom in private. And so that was a problem. Another thing that I see a lot of times is having separate spaces. So even in a work environment or a facility-based work program, there'll be one location for the people that work there that are employed by the agency, and then the others who work there who are people with disabilities. And so, what is the reason for that separate space? And so that would be something that that I would encourage people to evaluate. Privacy is another one. Having a private location for people to have their clothes changed if they need to change clothes. One agency that I saw had a day program where everybody received services. They were all in one room, and there was like a physical therapy table in the center of the room. And that physical therapy table, kind of one of like the low padded tables, that is where they would change someone. If someone needed a diaper change or a clothes change, they would change people on that table. Keep in mind that table was in the center of the room, and people did everything in that room. That's where they learned. That's where they socialized. That's where they ate their lunch. That's where everything was done. And so when somebody needed a change, it was done right in front of everyone. The other problem with that situation was that there was one wall of that building that opened to a courtyard, and it was just a wall of windows. And those windows weren't kept closed. And so when people needed a diaper change, anybody could see what was happening. And so it wasn't a very, it didn't afford them privacy, dignity, or respect. Having a place to store their personal belongings. When you and I go to work, we might have a desk where we can put things. And so do individuals that go to a program also have a place that they can store things? I'll also look at, see what kinds of things are posted. Do they talk about community? Do they post events about the community? Do they share that information? Do they provide information about transportation options for individuals? And then looking at policies and procedures. And one of the things that I look for specifically is blanket rules. And what blanket rules are rules that apply to all people with disabilities, but would never apply to you or I. So for example, everybody wears a bib when they eat lunch. Well, does everybody need to wear a bib when they eat lunch? Do they want to wear a bib when they eat lunch? Some people may prefer to not wear a bib, and even though they know they may get their clothes messed up, they may choose to bring a second set of clothes and then change their clothes. Another example is people being limited in what they can do, like how many items they can purchase from an internal store. So one provider agency did have a little shop where they sold candy, soft drinks, T-shirts, things like that. And people with disabilities were allowed to buy 2 items per day, but everybody else could buy as many items as they wanted. So it was just an arbitrary rule that was applied to everybody that received services, but it's a rule that would never have applied to you or I. And then having to ask permission for certain things. So permission to take a break, permission to eat lunch on their own, permission to go to the restroom. And I'm not saying that people should never ask permission or should never tell a supervisor or a work supervisor that they need to go to the restroom. But blanket rules, again, that apply to every person with a disability and don't apply to you or I are the kinds of rules that we need to look at and determine whether they're appropriate or not appropriate. And then when you're looking at rules, it's not just about what's written in policies and procedures, but it's also about what isn't in policies and procedures. There are a lot of situations where I have seen blanket rules that were implemented, and it's based on just how the organization operated. It wasn't written down, but they'd been operating a certain way for so long that they didn't even realize how they were operating. Oh, I realized I didn't advance the slides. Sorry. Some other rules that folks need to consider are AWOL protocols, restroom rules, program start and end times, conflict resolution, attendance records for billing, and behavior programs. And again, it doesn't mean that they're necessarily wrong, but those are areas where I've seen some blanket rules apply that were just put into place. And when you ask about, well, why do we do things this way? A lot of times it's, well, that's just the way that we've always done them. Another thing that I look at is how people speak to individuals in that setting. Do they refer to all of the adults as my kids, as if they own them and as if they're children? Do they have schedules that list, 10 o'clock is playground time? I like to go outside and sit at a picnic table, and I would swing, but I don't call it playground time for me. And so, looking at the words that are being used. There are some providers that operate programs as if it's a school, and it was like a school at one point in time, where it starts at 8:30, you have assembly, you do the Pledge of Allegiance. Some of the problems with that are that words are just so powerful. And when you treat an environment like an elementary school, then the people that are hired, that are working in there, start viewing individuals with disabilities as children. Now, as we know, the range of abilities is very wide when you're talking about people with disabilities. And what CMS is trying to accomplish is that people have choices, people have rights, and that people aren't all treated the exact same just because they have a disability, that they don't lose their rights, and they're not all treated one way just because they have a disability and just because they receive Medicaid funded services. In addition to looking at what people say, it's important to look at what's also written. So written communication is also very telling as to how people may be treated. Are they treated with dignity and respect in that environment? So I look at job descriptions and job titles. I will also look at your website. And so everything that I'm telling you that I look at are things that I'm encouraging you to look at. So, and I'll back up real quick to job titles and job descriptions. How you describe what the work that a person will do and how they will interact with a person with a disability does set the tone for how they respect that person, whether they treat them with dignity. Some of the, using words of supporting an individual, meaningful days, based on their interests, based on the person's choices, that sets the tone for what is to be expected from that point forward. Looking at the website, I look at, do they have admissions programs? It doesn't mean that you can't admit someone to a program, but admissions basically implies that you're moving somebody into something that's a predetermined program that they're fitting you into. Instead, you can mention, unlimited opportunities that everyone has, what services you offer to them, how you support them for them to have a good life, as opposed to a program you created that they can be placed into. There's some websites where I've seen where they talk about different enterprises. Again, it's where people are put into it, as opposed to using those enterprises to provide opportunities for people to learn and grow and advance in their life. Other things to look at is the employee handbooks, newsletters, forms, the planning documents that are used, and any official correspondence that is shared. And so that's a kind of overview of some of the things that I actually look for. I want to share with you some of the things that I'm seeing providers do in order to come into compliance with the CMS HCBS Settings Rule. One of the first things I've seen some remarkable leadership. One provider had an absolutely fantastic attitude. In a meeting, he shared with all of his staff, there are no limits. Do what is best for the person. Be creative, think outside the box. And if you run into any challenges, let me know and we will see how to problem solve. But if you're doing it with the person's best interests in mind, based on what the person wants, then I support you 100%. Also with leadership, seeing leaders empower their staff to develop people, not programs, moving away from that program mindset and focusing more on people. Another piece is recognizing the whole person. So I see providers moving away from, we offer these services, like a day programs just during the day, to really thinking about how do I offer these services and how do I do that and recognize the whole person and their whole life? How do I offer day services and recognize that the person has relationship goals and education goals, employment goals, community participation goals, health and wellness goals, and income and savings goals. And so again, it's not about offering the service, but recognize the person and the whole life of that person. I see providers offering a lot more choice and control to individuals. So a couple of examples that I'm seeing is that individuals choose what activities they do, that they're actually involved in planning their week. There's one program that what they do is what they offer changes all the time. And it changes based on what individuals that are coming into the program are saying that they're wanting. Offering choice about where they meet. Are they meeting at the library or a coffee shop? Instead of necessarily meeting always at the provider's physical location. Individuals choosing what they want to learn. having a personal growth and development program. And what people want to learn changes over time. One of the things that I do see often is that people and agencies get stuck in a program. They think, okay, people want to learn this, and they respond to what people want at that time, but then they don't ever change that. They just continue to offer that exact same thing. And then offering choice and control to individuals about how to spend their money and helping them budget for that. One of the challenges that providers often have is, okay, well, how do I offer choice in groups? And so what providers are doing is identifying the interests of individuals, and then they're creating groups of folks based on those interests. Whereas previously they may have been grouping people based on type of disability or age or gender or those kinds of things. But now they're actually focusing on what's important to the person and grouping them by interests. And, if you think about it, interest is usually how we as humans, how we all connect to others. We connect to people that have similar interests to ours. We're automatically drawn to them. And so creating groups based on interests helps with really good, helps people to get along well together in those groups. Another thing that providers are doing is they're using existing groups, but then those groups get together as a group and choose what the activities are that they want to do together. And then also another option for groups is that a provider hears about an interest or an opportunity, maybe some event that's in your town, and they find out who wants to participate in that, and they allow people to sign up, and they form the groups based on that particular interest or activity. Providers are expanding and trying to move away from groups when possible, and offer more individualized opportunities and also more unique opportunities. So for example, unique volunteer opportunities. One provider realized that through person-centered planning that an individual had a really deep interest in large cats, like large cats, like lions, tigers, kind of cats. And there was a large cat sanctuary in their community. And so they arranged for that individual to do volunteer opportunities at that location, as opposed to where they had been providing it at a local thrift store. And then providers are finding ways to individualize the focus within a program or within a curriculum. So for example, if they are already offering a computer class, or if they're already teaching people how to access public transportation, then within that class, they identify, well, what is it that's important to Johnny? What is important to Frank? What is important to Sue? And then, in that computer class, it could be that Johnny wants to get a job and he's working on developing a resume on the computer. It could be that, Frank is practicing some math skills, and that's what's important to him, or doing some game-based learning for money management. It could be that Sue just wants to play games because she is enjoying that time period. And so what is it that each person wants to do, what's important to them, and how do you incorporate that into a group activity? The same thing with teaching transportation. Is someone wanting to learn to access public transportation because they want to get a job? If so, recognize that and incorporate that into their learning. Does somebody want to access transportation so that they can go and visit family members on their own? If so, you work that into that training. Some other examples of an individual focus within a group structure. I think both of these are just great ideas that were both developed by the direct support workers that were working with the individuals and with the group. In one situation, there was an individual who didn't really speak English very well, but there were a lot of people in that agency who did speak Spanish. And this was an agency that was actually close to the Mexican border. And so they did have a lot of folks that that had come from Mexico and were now in the United States and working there. And so this one individual who, like I said, didn't speak Spanish very well, but said he wanted to learn how to speak Spanish. And so what they did is they created the DSP, the direct support professional, created a word of the day. And so she would share that word of the day with that person. And what was so amazing about what happened when she started focusing on what was important to him and individualizing this in this group environment is that it only took a very small amount of time to share the word of the day. But other people in the group also started picking up on it as well. And then other DSPs who worked and other people who worked in the agency realized that this individual was interested in learning their language, their primary language. And so they got excited about it. And so they would pass him in the halls and pass him, on their property and say, hey, Chris, what's the word of the day? Or they would share the word of the day with him. And so it developed a camaraderie between this individual based on their interest and others within that agency. So it was a really easy way to incorporate something very individualized, but the impact just actually grew for that individual. And another individual had an interest in hair and makeup and nails. And so, the way that they were structured, this is about 5 or 6 years ago, the way that they were structured is they would have different classes that people would attend. And one of them was personal care, where they would talk about caring for your hair and nails and things like that. But what they did is they supported that person to almost develop a little business where they developed business cards, helped them develop business cards to help them talk about, well, how would you market this to other people in the agency that you can do their hair or that you would help them do their nails. And so they encouraged this interest for this individual, and this really blossomed, and so did the individual. Another situation of group work and trying to individualize is taking traditional group work like contracts that are related to lawn care, but using it as an opportunity to have people develop skills like communication skills. How would they develop a business card for marketing lawn care services? How would they communicate to individuals? Encouraging them and supporting them to go from house to house to speak to people about doing lawn care. How do you make that shift from the solid group work to possibly a micro enterprise where they're able to earn wages on their own, but are supported by the agency in order to do that, as opposed to the group work. Providers are doing things to add variety. So if a program was just providing day habilitation services but not community-based employment services, then I see them expanding more and offering a wider variety of services. And then I see them also expanding options within each service. So for example, with employment, they may have been doing supported employment group, maybe doing some supported employment individual placement, but looking at so many other options, doing better discovery with employment, allowing folks to do exploration where they're visiting with others and discussing employment in different situations, having guest speakers, doing job shadowing, moving to more informational interviews, allowing a broader range of volunteering opportunities, customized employment, micro enterprises, self-employment, and then of course the traditional competitive integrated employment. And then I also see providers thinking outside the box and expanding locations. So, there's one provider agency that they had amazing outdoor space. Now, in Louisiana, where I am, there's a good part of the year where you don't want to be outside. It's just so hot and muggy, and when it's hot and muggy, there's bugs. And then you have bugs that stick to you because it's hot and muggy. I mean, it's not the best example, but there are some places of this country that just almost year round. It's absolutely beautiful. And if you have great outdoor spaces, take advantage of that. I mean, there are some people who prefer to be indoors. There are some people who prefer to be outdoors as much as possible. And so recognizing that and supporting that really can add to a meaningful day for individuals. I talked about expanding locations of meeting in a library, meeting in a coffee shop, but then also taking things that were facility based and seeing if it's feasible to move that elsewhere, if it makes sense. So for example, moving like a shredding contract to an employer's site as opposed to doing it on the provider site. And then adding flexibility. And so what I'm seeing is that providers are finding ways to make sure that people aren't limited to the same group with the same people day after day after day, and that those groupings can be flexible based on the interests of the individual. And then the other thing is that every plan A has a plan B, and the person has the option to opt out. Early on, when the rule went into place, I saw a lot of providers who said, all right, instead of people coming to our facility, we're going to have a schedule of what people need to do. They can go to Walmart on Mondays. They could go to the museum on Tuesdays. They can go to the bowling alley on Wednesdays. But the rule is not about moving a person's body from one geographic location to the other. And folks that are doing that are missing the whole point of the rule. The rule is about recognizing people as individuals and removing the barriers that people have to accessing all of the things that you and I are able to access. So allowing for backup plans for when an individual chooses to opt out, and then also allowing staff to deviate from schedules when it is based on the person's interests and allowing that flexibility to be in place. A few thoughts that I want to share about what folks are doing about community engagement. First, I just want to clarify that community is not just a physical location. The only reason that we go into the physical community is to make connections with people. Community is a feeling of fellowship with others as a result of sharing common attitudes, interests, and goals. So you can have online communities, you can have volunteer communities, political communities. It's where people get those connections with others. And yes, going into the physical community is a large part of where you make those connections. And so yes, that is important for people to have opportunities to do that. But what CMS says about these opportunities is that opportunities need to be for people to be able to seek employment and work in competitive integrated settings and engage in community life. Now, an opportunity doesn't mean necessarily bringing people and moving people's bodies. An opportunity is the set of circumstances that makes it possible to do something. So providers that are getting the CMS HCBS Settings Rule right are the ones that understand this piece, that it's not just about setting up a schedule if you're going to go to all these places and telling people where they're going to go. It's about removing barriers that limit people from engaging in the same things that you and I are able to engage in. And when we talk about engaging in community life, it's important to remember that people engage in community life in different ways. So for example, let's say, and nobody hate me, it's an LSU football example, but whatever your favorite football team is, think about the community life that goes around that football community. But people engage with that community in different ways. Some people might just wear sports clothing. Some people are really interested in keeping statistics. Some collect sports related items. Some decorate their homes that way. Some people will attend all the home games. Some people attend all the home games and the out of town games. Some people just go to the tailgate parties and then they go home and they don't even go to the game. Some people like to host parties at their homes or visit the campus or talk to others about the team. And so, people engage with the communities of their interest in different ways. The other thing is that different people have different barriers to the communities, to their communities that they're interested in. So barriers can be knowledge and information. So somebody might not know, when is the game? They might want to go to a game, but they might not know when it is, or how to buy the tickets, or where to buy shirts to wear to the game, They may not know who else is interested in going that they could go with. They may not be able to get there because of transportation, or they may not have the finances to purchase the ticket and they need someone to help them save because it's important to them. And they might need support when they get there. So when you talk about, how do you come into compliance and how do you support individuals to engage in the communities that they're choosing? First, it has to be of what communities are important to them. And then what are the barriers that keep them from engaging in those communities? Some things that I encourage people to do is expose individuals to different options. But exposure doesn't mean just move people's bodies around. I mean, exposure can be done in so many different ways. And the reason that I encourage exposure is because people can't make decisions about what they like and what they don't like if they know nothing about it. And asking a question is not really giving people a choice if they don't have all the background information that they need in order to make a good decision. And so ways that people can show that they are trying to provide opportunities for individuals and to learn what's important to people are by showing them things. Visual pictures can be shown. People can have discussions, planned discussions, but more informal discussions, showing them videos, having community members come and share information about activities or events, having staff and board members share information, and then facilitating opportunities for people to actually experience different things based on what's important to them and based on what communities are important to the individual. A few other innovative things that I've seen providers doing is instead of supporting an ended service or a service that ends when you start receiving that service, changing how services are designed. So instead of offering housing, offering transitional housing. So housing, someone may need some support, more intense support early on, and then how do you increase their level of independence over time to help them reach their highest potential? So transitional housing or college to career, and then also transportation, looking at creative transportation options. Some providers are actually doing contracts with Lyft and Uber to provide transportation so that the transportation is not just being provided by the provider agency. And then I see a lot of reallocating and restructuring resources. So some providers are selling, leasing, and repurposing some of their existing property and or using some of their existing space to develop community partnerships. So for example, a provider that has a pool on a larger campus is using that pool and some of their grounds for a day camp, and also renting out some of it to the Council on Aging for seniors to come and swim and have activities on their campus. Others are renting out some of their office space to other entities. And again, all of these things, there's not one right answer. And just because these are ideas that providers are implementing does not mean that it's going to be right for each provider agency. I'm trying to share a wide range of things that I'm seeing so that folks can just evaluate for themselves these ideas and determine what would work in their situation. One provider that has a really nice large kitchen is partnering with a culinary school to come in and use that kitchen. And so it's just another opportunity to bring in the community, use that space differently in ways that make sense. And then very quickly, I'm seeing changes in fundraising, more and more fundraising opportunities that bring in a much broader community presence, where the community is just really excited about participating in that fundraising event. And so this is one particular event where folks in the community design their own device to go down a river to see which one's most creative, which one is fastest, which one makes it. And it's something that the community just really rallies around. But it's more opportunity for community interaction. And then other things where plane pulls that draw in more community participation, dancing for a cause, is another one that just draws a really huge crowd, but it's something that gets the community excited and more involved with services. And then changes to training. And I only have a few more slides and then we'll open it up for some questions, but I'm seeing a lot of changes in training in the order that training is delivered, incorporating person-centered thinking, adding training on choices, rights, and opportunities for integration, training on customized employment, and training on making a meaningful day are some of the things that I'm seeing added to the training that's currently provided to employees of a provider agency. And so I kind of want to wrap up with this slide, and then we'll open it for questions and answers. But each entity is going to need to make decisions as to what is right for that particular agency. So whether it's you have a family member that receives services or you're a provider agency that provides services, those decisions need to be made at that level based on what the circumstances are in your area and what services are currently being provided and what resources you have available. But this is a very good general guide to help you determine whether or not you're going in the right direction with what's being done. And these questions I think are very helpful. Is what you're doing, is it important to the person? Is it important for the person? And the person agrees. Does the change allow people to learn something new? Does it allow people to have more choices? Does it allow people to interact with different people? Does it allow people to have a purpose? Does the change allow individuals to do the things that they like to do that are based on their interests? And then also, does the change pass the like you and I test? Does it make sense if it was you or I that were receiving services? Is it something that we would want? And if it doesn't, if you are having trouble answering these questions, then you may want to think about whether the decision is the best decision for ensuring compliance with the CMS HCBS Settings Rule. So I want to go ahead and open it up for questions that you have, and I'm game for anything. I don't mind, off the cuff questions. I may not always know the answer, and if I don't know the answer, I will let you know and I'll find the answer. So,
Laura, this is Scott Mendel. One of our participants has asked how the setting, whether an HCBS setting can be located near a clinic, hospital, or medical center. And is there some prescribed distance or number of feet that the setting must be away from such facilities?
So the challenge that you have, the challenge is what is the state requiring versus what is the federal government requiring. The federal government does not have any requirements about number of feet that anything is located, doesn't have any requirements on number of buildings, doesn't have any requirements on percent of time that a person spends in the community or the number of people that they are spending time with that do not have disabilities. And I actually want to say a comment about this. I know that there are places where where rules have been put into place about the percent of time, and lots of questions have been asked about the number of, how many people with disabilities compared to people without disabilities. And I actually think that's horrible. I think that's absolutely horrible that you would say that there's a number of people that people with disabilities have to spend time around, because what that to me says is that you're telling that person your life is good if you're around X number of people who don't have a disability. So then what are we saying about being around people with disabilities, that their life is not good if they're around people with disabilities? I think that's terrible. And then in terms of percents, to me, percents they're not required by CMS, but when they are in place, I think that what states are trying to do is get providers to to push a little bit. I think they're trying to push providers a little bit, because I think that there's been so much of a response of people saying, oh, well, so-and-so wants to come here. They don't want to do such and such, but they've never really given that person an opportunity to make an informed decision. And so that is a problem. And so I think that that's where some of these percent requirements come into place. But in terms of number of feet, no. Number of buildings, no. Percent of time in the community, no. Number of people with a disability or percent of people with and without disabilities, no. None of those are requirements of CMS.
Yeah, Laura, I totally agree. I think what state folks are trying to do is to take a rule that's pretty vague and make it something that's simple for them to enforce. And obviously, once you apply some objective standards like percentages of time in the community and number of folks, that's something they can easily go through and check the box. Are you doing it? Are you not doing it? It just makes their jobs a lot easier. But I totally agree with you. It's the absolute wrong way to approach this rule. One other question that folks put in the chat is, you didn't specifically address in your presentation how to go about offering choices and making sure that the settings rule is complied with for folks with the most significant needs, folks that might be categorized as severe and profound. And how do we make sure that those folks are treated in a way that would qualify for HCBS funding? And
so I've actually had a board member of a provider agency one time, was in the training, and she had a sister who had a very significant disability. And she said to me, she goes, I get this. This is great, but this is not for my sister. She's never going to be able to tell you what is important to her. But I support this for other people. And so, what my response was at the time and still remains is that the rule is for everyone, that we should be trying for everyone. People communicate in various ways. And yes, people are not going to be able to tell you, I want to go here, or I don't want to go here. But people can tell you what they like and what they don't like. And so what I encourage providers to do is to try and identify what's important to individuals. So give you an example. I was interviewing some direct support professionals who worked with a group of individuals who had very, very significant disabilities. All of them used a wheelchair for mobility, and all of them did not voice communication and had very little behavior communication. So even yes, no was not consistent in terms of communication. And so, but when you ask them, well, what is it that these folks like, that the people that you support, what is important to them? What do they like? One of the DSPs, she's like, Chris loves Elvis music, not just music, but Elvis music. And so I asked, well, how do you know that? Well, what they had done is they had tried playing different types of music, and he liked all kinds of music. He seemed happier. He seemed more alert. He, seemed to be paying attention, would keep his eyes directed at where they were playing the music from, would move a little bit. But then when they found that they played Elvis music, he was so much more alert. And it's what they've learned over time. And so learning what's important to people, it can be done. And even though it takes time, but in terms of like, are you going to bring that person out into the community? Are you going to bring that person to certain types of events? I think that is something that needs to involve the individual and the people that are, that others that individual wants in a planning meeting, including family, or if the family is guardian, they may be making those decisions for the individual. And they'll be taking all things into consideration as to what makes a meaningful day for that person, what's important to the person, but also what's important for the person. And so, here in Louisiana, I told you about how hot and muggy it is. If you go out into the community and you use a wheelchair for mobility, you're sweating at like 7:30 in the morning. That is something that is not necessarily good for people who are using a wheelchair and could be problematic. And so all of those things need to be taken into consideration. What if it's raining? What if it's snowing? All of that needs to be taken into consideration about what's important to the person and what's important for the person. And it needs to be based on their choices. Again, the CMS rule does not require that you bring people physically move their bodies. What the rule says is that you provide opportunities for people to gain employment in the community and engage in community life. And when you look at the definition of opportunity, it's that set of circumstances that makes it possible to do something. So you remove the barriers for the person for what's important to them. And that's what the role of the provider should be. But it should always be based on what the individual's choices and preferences are.